Two children escaped their father's house at midnight. After their mother died, their father remarried her best friend, believing it would keep the family together. Instead, the woman mistreated the children whenever he was away. They tried to tell their father, but he refused to listen, convinced grief was confusing them. Everything changed the night they overheard her planning to get rid of them. They left without warning. What happened next did not just save them. It reshaped their future. The house used to feel loud in a good way. Even after the funeral, it held the rhythm of life. Shoes kicked off in a pile near the door, the low hum of a video game, and the anticipation of the lock turning. When their father came home, loosening his tie and feigning exhaustion, the heaviness of the day would lift. He would sink into the couch, pulling the boy and the girl into a messy, side-hugging embrace, filling the empty corner where their mother used to sit with warmth. Their father tried harder than anyone knew. He showed up to every meeting, burned breakfast on weekends, and eventually, when he said it was time to remarry, he chose safety. He brought home Elena, their mother's closest friend. She wasn't a stranger. She was the woman who had held them at the funeral, the one who knew their names without asking. At first, nothing cracked. She played the part perfectly. She smiled when their father was home, sat close to him on the sofa, and asked the right questions about school. The children watched her closely, waiting for a slip, but none came. Weeks passed, then months. The house felt steady, almost whole again. It was only when their father began traveling more for work that the tone of the house shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It started small, like a slow leak. Dinner portions began to shrink. Rules started changing arbitrarily, depending on her mood. Slowly, she stopped joining them downstairs. She retreated to the upper floors, closing doors softly but firmly, leaving the children in a silence that felt heavy and deliberate. When the boy asked about dinner, there were no apologies, just a cold statement that he was too late. When the girl cried over a scraped knee or a bad day, Elena didn't offer comfort. She simply remarked that tears were a desperate plea for attention. The children tried to fix it. They waited until a weekend when their father was home and relaxed. They chose their words carefully, on trying to bridge the gap without sounding ungrateful. But their father just listened, nodding with a tired smile. "Grief can twist memories," he told them gently. "Adjustment takes time. I trust her, and I need you to trust me." After that, the children stopped talking. They learned to move through the house like ghosts. The boy counted pantry items in his head to ration food. The girl memorized which floorboards creaked so she could avoid them. They watched the clock when their father was away, counting the hours until the house became safe again. It no longer felt lived in. It felt managed. Late one night, the boy woke to the sound of voices. It wasn't shouting. It was laughter. He followed the noise down the hallway and stopped halfway. Elena was on the phone, her voice clear and cutting in the quiet house. She wasn't whispering. She was speaking with the confidence of someone who knew no one was listening. "I'm done pretending," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "The children, they're just in the way. I want this marriage clean. I want them gone." The boy did not go back to bed. He went to his sister's room and woke her slowly. He put a finger to his lips, pulled on his shoes, and took her wrist gently. They moved through the dark house, past the woman laughing on the phone, and slipped out the front door. It closed behind them without a sound. They walked until the suburban sprawl began to thin, the streetlights stretching farther apart into pockets of darkness. The girl did not ask questions. She simply trusted the pull of her brother's hand and the steadiness of his pace. When the night air grew cool enough to sting her fingers, He noticed her shivering and slowed down just enough to tuck her hand deeper into his sleeve, offering what little warmth he could without stopping. The bus stop sat desolate near a closed grocery store, marked only by a bench with peeling paint and a torn schedule taped to the glass. They sat close together, shoulders touching to share warmth against the metal dampness. The boy checked his pockets again, a nervous reflex, even though he knew the truth of their situation. No phone, no wallet, and no plan beyond the next set of headlights. When the bus finally hissed to a halt in front of them, the driver studied them through the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing at two unaccompanied minors in the middle of the night. He didn't raise his voice, but his question about their parents hung heavy in the air. The boy answered without drama. He's speaking carefully and clearly, utilizing the same polite tone he used when teachers were watching. The driver sighed, a sound of resignation rather than annoyance, and reached into his own pocket to cover their fare. "Sit near the front," he muttered, waving them on. As the bus rolled forward, the familiar city blurred into something quieter and unknown. The girl rested her head against the vibration of the window, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. The boy, however, stayed alert, counting the stops and watching the strangers who boarded and exited. A woman whispered to the man beside her, glancing their way. Someone else shook their head in pity. But no one interfered. They rode until the gray light of morning crept across the road. The driver pulled over near an old, weathered station, turning to tell them this was as far as the line went. The boy thanked him twice, his gratitude genuine, while the girl tightened her grip on his hand as they stepped down onto the pavement. The town was smaller than he had expected, comprised of just one main road, a bakery that was just beginning to smell of yeast, and a hardware store with lights humming to life inside. The boy navigated by the memory of their mother's voice, stories she had told about this place, about a man who lived here once, and about the family that stayed when others left. They found the house at the edge of town, marked by a narrow yard and a porch with a loose step that groaned under their weight. The boy knocked once, a solid, decisive sound, and then waited. When the door opened, a man with graying hair looked down at them. He listened to the boy's hurried, a quiet explanation without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped aside, opening the space for them to enter. "Come in," was all he said. Life changed shape after that. The uncle was a man of few words. He showed them their room and laid out the rules with a calm authority. School attendance was mandatory. Chores were to be done before rest, and meals happened at set times. The structure felt strange after the unpredictability of their father's house, but it also felt safe. For the first time in months, the girl slept through the night, and the boy stopped checking the locks on the door. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of the house took hold. The uncle woke early, and he expected the same from them. He asked about grades with genuine interest and fixed broken things around the house, and explaining the mechanics of each repair as the boy watched closely. The girl listened, absorbing these new routines like a second language. In town, they became known entities. A cashier asked where they had come from, and a neighbor offered extra bread, murmuring that it was good they had found their way. The boy nodded and kept moving, learning quickly that survival did not require attention. It required consistency. School began without ceremony. The boy sat in the back, quiet and observant, measuring the room before he spoke. The girl kept her eyes on her notebook, writing neatly and erasing mistakes until the page looked perfect. At night, the boy thought about their father, imagining explanations forming too late in his mind, but he never reached out. He did not write. He did not call. And the uncle did not ask for details about why they had left. He simply watched them eat, watched them finish their homework, and turned off the lights at the same hour every night. Order replaced fear, slowly, without the need for empty promises. By winter, the girl smiled more easily, and the boy stood straighter. They had learned the town's rhythm and where silence belonged. Nothing felt rescued, but everything felt earned, built one ordinary day after another. By the second year, the uncle began to treat them less like fragile guests and more like members of the household who carried their own weight. He made no formal announcement of this shift. He simply expected more. The boy found work at a local hardware store after school, starting with the broom and the dustpan. He swept floors until the wood gleamed, then graduated to stocking shelves, and eventually he learned to fix the small, broken things customers brought in with frustration written on their faces. He listened more than he spoke, a trait the owner noticed and rewarded with longer shifts. While her brother worked, the girl spent her afternoons in the kitchen. At first, she followed the uncle's instructions with the precision of a lab technician, measuring flour to the gram and watching timers with intense focus. The uncle corrected her only when she rushed, his voice low and steady. "Food carries memory," he told her one evening as she kneaded dough too aggressively. "And memory deserves patience." When she burned a batch of bread the following week, she cried quietly over the sink. He didn't coddle her, he simply told her to start again. So, she did. And money entered their lives slowly, arriving in envelopes with the boy's name written in ink. He did not spend it on the things other teenagers bought. Instead, he lined the bills inside a shoebox tucked deep under his bed. He counted them at night, not out of excitement, but out of a need for control. Knowing exactly what they had was the only way to measure how far they were from the life they had escaped. The girl's curiosity grew beyond the uncle's kitchen. She borrowed towering stacks of cookbooks from the town library, copying recipes into a notebook and making careful notes in the margins about what worked and what failed. She shared her experiments with the neighbors, who accepted the offerings with surprise. "You have good hands," a woman told her once, accepting a loaf of sourdough. "Don't waste them." School events came and went, and the uncle attended when his presence was required, sitting in the back row and listening without comment. Teachers reported that the boy was reliable, and the girl was singularly focused. No one asked about their past, and the town seemed content to accept what stood in front of them. Years moved forward without ceremony. The boy grew taller, his shoulders broadening under the weight of his own expectations. He learned to budget his time as strictly as he budgeted his money, passing on outings and distractions. When classmates asked why he worked so much, he offered only a vague explanation. "I have plans," was all he would say. The girl discovered her true calling late, almost by accident. A visiting instructor held a short workshop at the school, demonstrating how dough changed under pressure and heat. She watched, mesmerized, as effort transformed into structure. Something settled in her chest that day, a feeling of certainty she hadn't known she was missing. She told her brother about it that night. He listened, then asked what the tuition would cost. When she answered honestly, he nodded and added a new column to his notebook. They talked less and less about the night they left. It stayed present in the room without being spoken, a shadow they both acknowledged but refused to name. Occasionally, the boy wondered if their father searched for them. He imagined letters unsent and apologies delayed, but each time, and the thought ended the same way. Searching did not undo the choice of silence when it mattered most. The uncle aged quietly, his routines remaining firm even as his movements slowed. He never claimed credit for their successes. He merely corrected mistakes and expected improvement. When the girl applied to pastry school, he read the forms twice before signing them without comment. The boy covered the fees, watching his sister leave for classes each morning with a new purpose in her step. She studied harder than anyone in her group, staying late to practice until her hands ached and her apron was dusted white. When she graduated, her name sat at the top of the list. She called her brother first. He left work early to stand in the back of the room, clapping once, then again, his face masking a fierce pride. And they rented a small space together shortly after. The bakery opened quietly, without banners or fanfare, just the smell of fresh bread and light spilling through the window. Customers came, and then they returned. Growth followed effort, not luck. When the time came to expand, it felt earned. 7 years after the night they left, the bell above the door rang differently. The boy looked up from the counter and recognized the weight of the silence that followed. Their father stood there. He looked older, thinner, holding a lifetime of regret like a peace offering he wasn't sure he was allowed to give. The girl froze, a tray of dough suspended in her hands. The ovens hummed behind her, and the future paused, waiting to see what they would do. The father did not step forward right away. He remained rooted near the entrance, looking as though he were waiting for an invitation that might never come. The rich, warm scent of yeast and caramelized sugar filled the space, a smell that spoke of patience and careful timing, standing in stark contrast to his sudden, chaotic arrival. A few customers glanced up, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, but quickly looked away to give them privacy. The boy broke the standoff not with words, but with a sharp nod toward the small, scarred table near the window used for deliveries and paperwork. Understanding the silent command, the older man moved forward, sitting with a caution that suggested he was afraid the chair might collapse under the weight of his history. He folded his hands together on the table, gripping them tight, as if to stop them from shaking. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking under the strain of the years. "I didn't see the truth until the house was empty." He told them he had been searching, that the realization of his mistake had come too late, and that his marriage had disintegrated the moment he understood Elena wanted only his assets and his silence. He repeated that he was sorry, pausing after each sentence as if expecting them to absolve him or perhaps to yell, but the room remained quiet. The girl remained behind the safety of the counter, her flour-dusted hands resting flat on the cool surface. She had played this scene out in her mind 1,000 times, inventing different endings for each one, but none had prepared her for how starkly ordinary the reality felt. Her breathing slowed, becoming measured and deliberate. The boy approached the conversation like an audit, asking questions with a terrifying calm. He wanted to know where his father had searched, when exactly the blindfold had fallen, and why the timeline of his realization had stretched into years. The father answered each query, though some answers landed softly, while others seemed to disintegrate before they reached across the table. The boy absorbed it all without flinching, cataloging the facts rather than the emotions. When the conversation lulled, the hum of the convection ovens clicked off behind the girl, plunging the room into a sudden quiet. She wiped her hands on her apron and finally crossed the floor, stopping just short of the table. She did not sit. Instead, she stood over him, close enough to see the gray that had invaded his hair. "You want to come back now," she said, her voice steady. "But why do you think your regret outweighs what we did to survive?" The father opened his mouth, but closed it again, finding no answer that could bridge the gap between them. Outside, the rumble of a delivery truck reminded them that life did not pause for reconciliation. The uncle arrived moments later, stepping into the tension with his usual unhurried gait. He took in the scene, the father's slumped posture, the children's rigid defiance, and greeted the visitor with a polite, impenetrable nod. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a light but grounding weight that signaled clearly where his loyalty lay. Nothing was resolved that afternoon. The father stood up, looking smaller than the boy remembered, and asked for time, just a chance to know the people they had become. The boy listened, the girl stayed silent, and the uncle offered no platitudes. When the door clicked shut behind him, the bakery returned to itself, the silence settling back into the corners as if he had never been there. That night, the siblings sat at the small window table after the lights were dimmed. They counted receipts and reviewed orders for the morning, the routine serving as a balm against the disruption. The uncle poured tea, the steam rising between them in the quiet dark. No one rushed to speak. They knew that whatever came next would not be dictated by a stranger's guilt. It would be decided the way everything else in their lives had been, slowly, deliberately, and on their own terms. The father did not return again. Weeks bled into months without a letter, a call, or the sound of the bell signaling his re-entry into their lives. And the bakery did not pause to mourn the absence. Instead, it thrived on the rhythm of early mornings and the steady upward trajectory of their hard work. The boy took charge of expansion, negotiating delivery contracts in neighboring towns with a calm demeanor that never rushed nor oversold their capacity. Meanwhile, the girl pruned her menu with a ruthless eye for quality, discarding anything that didn't meet her exacting standards until business grew not out of sympathy for their story, but out of respect for their craft. The uncle watched this evolution from a comfortable distance, satisfied but never indulgent. He often reminded them that stability was not a finish line to be crossed, but a machine that required constant maintenance. As the years wore on, his steps grew slower, and his advice became more concise, and yet his presence remained the anchor of their home. The roles began to shift naturally. The siblings moved to protect him with the same quiet vigilance he had once used to shield them. They forgave him, but they never wanted him back. The girl came to understand that forgiveness was not a transaction that required a reunion. It was simply a clarity of spirit that allowed her to move forward without carrying the dead weight of the past. The boy reflected on the night they had fled, realizing with certainty that their silence had saved them when explanations would have surely failed. Neither of them felt unfinished. They were whole, not because of who they had lost, but because of who they had become. One evening, after the last receipt was counted and the lights were dimmed, they stood outside the bakery watching the street quiet down for the night. The boy turned the lock with a decisive click, while the girl leaned against the glass, feeling the residual warmth of the ovens pressing against the cool night air. They did not speak of their father. There was no need to resurrect a ghost when the reality they had built was so solid. They had constructed a life that did not depend on being believed by anyone but each other. They had chosen themselves when no one else would, and whatever regret the father carried was now his alone to bear. If you were in their shoes, knowing that survival often demands we leave people behind, would you have opened the door to let him back in? Subscribe for more real stories about survival, choices, and the quiet moments that change everything.